Shearer West is a great theorist of portraiture, but is actually here because she presided over the AHRC during a key period when I think the ambitions of the Funding Council changed, and also its work in relation to museums changed.
Thank you, Nick. I should also say I'm currently at Oxford. I'm the head of humanities here, and I am a visitor for the Ashmolean. So I'm involved in museums and galleries and have been in many capacities over the years. I want to say a little bit about the relationship between universities and museums and galleries generally, and then come down to university museums and galleries specifically after my first 5 minutes or so. I want to talk about mission divergence and aligned mission. And I think we went through a period of divergence of mission, and now our missions are aligned in all kinds of ways. And I think that's sort of what I want to sort of trace and think about. And I think what I have to say does actually align in certain ways with comments that have already been made by Paul and Nick. And I just want to start with a kind of personal anecdote. I was the head of an art history department at Birmingham in the 1990s, and some of you may remember this event. Basically, there was an event that we were called together as heads of Department of Art History with some museum directors in the Paul Mellon Centre in London to have our heads banged together because we were in a standoff against each other. Art historians were felt to be abandoning the object and being too theoretical, and museum curators were thought to be going down object cubbyholes and not thinking about the bigger picture. And we were basically told, you know, to get our act together and stop threatening the next generation of not being able to talk to each other. And that sort of standoff that we had at that time, and this was specifically with art history, was I think exacerbated in all kinds of ways by, over the years, by diverse government department missions that were fed down through universities and through museums and galleries to give them different kinds of targets. So universities were increasingly pushed through various RAEs to increase their research quality, museums and galleries, public museums and galleries to increase their bringing in of the public, their public footprint. And at that point in the 1990s, and I can't remember the exact year, it did seem as if there was just not going to be any way of us to come together. But I think a series of policy changes and missions changed over that period of time, and it puts us in a very interesting position now. I think the AHRC had a lot to do with this, and this isn't because I worked there, because all of this started happening before my time, in setting up collaborative doctoral awards. And these were actually, quote, establishing links that have long-term benefits for both collaborating partners. And again, there was an idea that particularly with universities and museums and galleries who could form one set of partnerships through these awards, that they should somehow find ways of working together. And it was very bumpy at the beginning because, again, these separate missions found a sort of interesting divergence through students. So the students, the graduate students, the postgraduate students who got these awards gradually became a kind of glue that brought these sectors together and more closely, and we found that really interesting. So the students became the relationship brokers through the collaborative doctoral awards, and now, very interestingly, the AHRC has announced a different, I think was mentioned earlier on, a different collaborative scheme that is actually run from the museums and galleries who go out to the universities rather than the universities going to the museums and galleries. I think another thing that happened during this period was curatorial work of various kinds surrounding exhibitions particularly became increasingly submitted to the REF, or the RAE as was. So increasing numbers of exhibitions as curatorial projects as well as publications from exhibitions began coming to be assessed through the research assessment exercise. And I think what we've had in the last 2 or 3 years, of course, is the whole move towards the emphasis on impact, which has already been mentioned. We've got open access coming now and public benefit, all creating, I think, a more common mission between museums and galleries and academic departments and universities. So in this, I think the university, and Paul has already alluded to this, university museums and galleries, to me, are in a very interesting situation. The AHRC Collaborative Doctoral Awards require the universities to have partners that are outside the universities. So we can't apply in Oxford for a collaborative doctoral award where an academic is working with the Ashmolean, for example. We can apply for an ordinary doctoral award in that sphere, but not a collaborative one. So the idea there that, you know, somehow you have to go out, the UCL could apply to work with the Ashmolean, but we can't because it's part of the university. 2 years ago, there was a famous moment when David Willits came here to Oxford, and at that point, he didn't realize that university museums and galleries were actually funded via HEFC. So he actually basically said, and I think he said it to Christopher actually, that he shouldn't be asked about university museums and galleries because they were funded by DCMS. And that was a moment where he had to go away and get his ear bent by various people, and now he knows the truth. So I think there is a kind of interesting situation there, really. And finally, I think I just want to say, I was really interested in Nick's comment that museums were not like libraries. And I think that's an interesting thing to kind of contemplate. The changes in the expectation of funding from HEFC when the funding for museums and galleries of universities came out of the AHRC's pocket, as it were, and went straight to HEFC's. The AHRC was looking at the curatorial and stewardship functions of university museums and galleries, and as I'm sure you heard David speak this morning, HEFC's role is more interested in funding teaching, learning, and research that the museums and galleries do for the nation, not just for their own institutions. And I think that that puts us in a very, very interesting situation. And just to finish, I think, speaking again, coming from Oxford, where we have the tradition of the greats, or the literae humaniores, as they're sometimes called, which is a sort of text-based history of learning and research. And we've always had material and visual culture through art history, through archaeology. We even have expertise in the history of the book, which is a sort of material culture object. But ironically, we might be able to see in a digital and virtual world that libraries are becoming increasingly curatorial, and museums and galleries are taking on a kind of new type of library role that isn't about the lone scholar, and that isn't about sitting alone on your carrel reading a book, but actually not only has new sources for research, but new opportunities for developing research methodologies. So different kinds of engagements with the past, more collaborative work I think is possible, and different ways of thinking about history, particularly because I am a historian, through the objects themselves. So I think we're in a very interesting time in policy terms, in terms of our missions, which I do think are increasingly aligned, and how we can draw ourselves together more and you know, for a sort of greater impact, really, but in every sense of the word, in research terms. So thank you.
I mentioned earlier that over the last decade there'd been a raft of new research grants based in and driven by museums, and I particularly hope that Chris Gosden might be able to join us for this panel, because he was someone who really led that move with a series of hugely important celebrated projects from his time at the Pitt Rivers. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Nick. Yes. So the central question of this meeting, what are university museums for, I would say is a slightly misleading question. I think it's misleading in two respects. It hints at a separation between the university more broadly and the university museum, which I think is wrong. So one of the things that I'm going to, yes I do, one of the things I'm going to argue for, material culture. One of the things I'm going to argue for is the constitutive aspect of the university museums, that universities have become the things that they've become because they've got university museums within them. And secondly, I'm going to argue that the important aspect of a university museum is its changing relationship with the emergence of disciplines. And particularly in the 21st century, that relationship is to do with a set of interdisciplinary spaces which then interact with the subject disciplines in particular ways. Now, I'm sorry about the Oxford-centred nature of what I'm about to say, but I did want to exemplify my broader points in more particular ways, and I'm hoping, although I'm going to talk about Oxford, that what I'll say will be relevant elsewhere. So I'm just going to give you the briefest possible history of the university museums in this city. Here you get 2 museums for the price of 1. This is currently the University Museum of Science and Technology, which was opened in 1923, but of course was the original Ashmolean Museum when it opened in 1683. One of the constitutive aspects of museums is that as soon as they came into existence, collections which were in the university anyway, so in the case of the original Ashmolean, things that were in the Bodleian Library, things that were in colleges, moved into the Ashmolean to complement the original Tradescant collections, which was its basis. So objects have moved around the university once the museums come to be. I really like this. This is Paul's Museum, which goes under various names, University Museum of Natural History. But one of the things it was called in the past was the Museum in the Parks, because in the old days there was nothing around it. It was set up by people like Ackland, who was a professor of surgery, and Ruskin, in order to promote science generally within the university. And again, as soon as the University Museum opened the Natural History Museum opened in 1860, collections moved into it. Some of the Ashmolean collections moved across, college collections, various things happened. I don't know if I've got a pointer here. So this is a plan of the museum. It's not really working. A plan of the museum in 1910. You might be able to see right in the middle there. Maybe I can use the... here we go. Right in the middle here is the central court. And there were different disciplines. There was anatomy, there was medicine, there was mineralogy. But the court itself was incredibly important because it was thought to bring together those separate disciplines into a single space around collections, around laboratory spaces, so that people could talk to each other. It seems anomalous that the museum is in the science area, but of course the science area is there because of the museum. All the disciplines that exist, well, many of the disciplines that exist in the science area started in the University Museum and then expanded out. So this is what I mean by the constitutive aspect of the museum, that the museum brought into being science as we understand it within the university today. And we can't understand the history of those scientific disciplines without some thought of the museum. The museum that I worked in for a long time, the Pitt Rivers Museum, which here in 1909 was the Pitt Rivers collection, you hopefully can see, there we go, here's the, yeah, I'll think of it. Is next to the anatomy department within the University Museum, and Pitt Rivers' original collection came in as part of the anatomy department, which seems extraordinary today, but in that high Darwinian moment where anatomy was documenting biological diversity, then Pitt Rivers' collection documented human diversity, and there was a synergy there, which we find both intriguing and confronting now. So this is the Pitt Rivers, around again 1910, about the same time as the plan that we saw before. And when the Pitt Rivers came into being in 1884, then material from the Ashmolean moved to the Pitt Rivers, material from the Natural History Museum moved to the Pitt Rivers. So the museums are part of a series of convection currents which move material around the university and are concrete examples of the intellectual climates of the time as things are recategorised and rethought. We, as Nick said, we ran a thing called the Relational Museum a few years ago, funded by the ESRC, and the idea behind the Relational Museum was that we can see museums as relatively static things, but they are actually objects in motion in many different ways. So we try to chart relationships between the original producers and makers of objects, many of which are ethnographic in the Pitt Rivers case, collectors, curators, various different people, and to set the museum in motion and to see it as a series of changing sets of relationships. Here's the book of the project, available in all good bookshops. And one of the things that we thought was that collections provide a sort of barium meal of intellectual life at the time. So in the later 19th century, when the Pitt Rivers Museum was put together, many of the people collecting for the museum were members of the Royal Geographical Society, the Linnean Society, the Royal Society, and so on. So the collections allow us to understand a set of connections between people, between subject areas. And of course the museum became extremely important in the teaching, in this case of anthropology, which started in 1905. Museums are full of surprising things. I'm mildly allergic to Morris dancing, but Pitt Rivers has a reasonable collection of Morris material. Well, one of the surprising things that we found out from the Relational Museum, looking at the Pitt Rivers collections, was that the country best represented in terms of collections was England. There are 44,000, depending on how you calculate these things, there are 44,000 objects from England in the Pitt Rivers Museum, which get hidden behind the totem poles, the shrunken heads, and all of those sorts of things. So as people were defining the other, they were also defining themselves. And this is one of everyone's favourite objects who knows about it. Again, a confronting object. This is an onion found up a pub chimney in Wellington in Somerset. It has a piece of paper wrapped round it, held with pins. That paper has the name of a temperance campaigner, and the onion was almost certainly put up the chimney by the landlord of the pub to harm the temperance campaigner who was trying to get his pub closed down. So there is magic alive and well in late 19th century England, as well as a form of rationality. One reading of museums generally, which was common in the 1990s, was a reading inspired by Foucault. So museums in this notion were part of an attempt to understand the world, to control the world, part of a link between power and knowledge, between orderliness and understanding. But I think one can reverse that reading, although it has some merit. Museums are also disorderly. They keep moving. Every time you turn your back on a museum, it's not quite the same when you look at it again. Things move. They don't fit within neat boxes. I mean, how do you think about an onion with a piece of paper around it, which was an object of magic? And they are disruptive of general patterns of thought. In the 21st century, where universities have come to be based around disciplines, then the strengths of disciplines are obvious. Disciplines allow people to attend to particular aspects of reality through physical kit and experimental means, through means of subsequent analyses, tropes of discussion about the various aspects of the world that people are interested in. And disciplines are obviously incredibly powerful in generating knowledge. The problem with disciplines often is that they have a tendency to parochialism. We all think that the bit of the world that we're really interested in is the most important bit. And the methods that we're using are the best methods, and everybody else ought to be using them. Museums guard against parochialism of this kind because their central aim is to look after collections. Then people come at them from a whole range of different directions. And it's hard to come to a museum with a single disciplinary mindset. So if university museums didn't exist, it would be necessary to invent them. And now that they do exist, the key question is how to make best use of them in the present climate. Thank you very much.